It's hard to wrap your head around Fay Dunaway. First of all, what a resume. You already know the big roles, but if we zoom in just to the times where Dunaway played real people, there's Bonnie Parker, of course, but there's also Eva Perón, Amy Semple McPherson, Wallace Simpson, Joan Crawford. What a gallery of rogues. So is Fay Dunaway all about glamour, or do these tricky roles hint at a different type of motivation? Dunaway didn't do a ton of interviews. There are quite a few stories of her being difficult. Was she a diva? Well, now that I've watched 5 Fay Dunaway movies in a row, and 12 and a half in my lifetime, and watched the HBO documentary Faye from this year, which isn't very good, and read Fay Dunaway's Autobiography from 1995, here it is. I'm going to talk about this book quite a bit. Now I feel maybe I can answer some of these questions. Well, look, I can try to. Why not? Don't worry, we'll talk about one more movie too, which is Puzzle of a Downfall Child from 1970, directed by her boyfriend/ex-boyfriend, Jerry Schatzberg. First things first, who is the real Fay Dunaway? I think the big secret is that despite her being a method actor, or perhaps because of it, the real Fay Dunaway is more or less the person that you see in all the movies. So was she a diva? Well, imagine making a movie with Bonnie Parker, or with Lou Andreas Sand, or with Gwen from The Arrangement. That's probably a bit like what it was like to make a movie with Fay Dunaway. Of course, it's not quite that simple, but as I've watched all these Fay Dunaway movies, it's been impossible to ignore certain traits that come up again and again, and I think they're sort of virtuous. I mean, yeah. What makes her her signature things? Why are all of her characters so driven, but also tormented, desirous, but also kind of cold, almost cruel, and a little distant? I think that's part of Fay Dunaway. I think it comes from her. Of course, I'll give you some evidence for this as we go on through this video. Let's take a little step back first. We have a lot of ground to cover here. This might be a long video, so here's the plan. First, I'm going to give you my ranking of every Fay Dunaway movie I've seen. Then we'll have a meta comment on the book and the documentary and just how you might go about researching Dunaway if you wanted to do that. Then I'll give you some interesting biographical information, stuff you can't find on Wikipedia, not yet at least. I might add it. Some things that I wish I'd known before I'd watched some of these movies. And finally, we'll talk about Puzzle of a Downfall Child, which I think actually is a really good conclusion to everything else that I'm going to get to, but maybe you can be the judge of that if you can make it through this whole video. Let's get to the rankings. There are going to be 2 big surprises here, maybe. If you follow the channel, you might already know one of them. The worst Fay Dunaway movie I've seen is A Place for Lovers. I have a video about that movie. Go check it out. The video, not the movie. Then we have Eyes of Laura Mars, which is a cool early performance from Tommy Lee Jones, an actor you almost universally hear good things about from other actors and from directors. The theme for that movie is by Barbra Streisand. It's a kind of okay song. She didn't want to be in the movie. Fay Dunaway plays a photographer. Make a note, because photography was a big part of Dunaway's life. That's a New York movie. Fay Dunaway has probably spent more of her life in New York City than anywhere else. Apparently, when they were filming the scenes in Columbus Circle, Elia Kazan stopped by to say hi. We'll talk a lot more about him as well. Maybe I need to speed things up, though. Number 3 is the Thomas Crown Affair. I have a video about it. This movie definitely has virtues, and it made a big impact at the time, but it falls short for me. Next, we have The Towering Inferno. I have a video about this one, too. It's from a little while ago. Maybe The Thomas Crown Affair is better than Towering Inferno. I mean, surely it is, right? Well, I don't know. The Towering Inferno is pretty fun. Fay Dunaway is barely in it, though. She makes a couple interesting notes about it in her book. Next, we have Little Big Man. Hey, I have a video about it. Maybe now you've already figured out the first big surprise, which is that next on the list is Puzzle of a Downfall Child. Whoa, atop Little Big Man? Maybe this is a mistake, but generally speaking, I actually thought this movie was pretty good, or at least not bad. We'll talk about it more in a little bit. Next, we have Arizona Dream. Did you know that Amir Kusturica made a movie with Johnny Depp, Fay Dunaway, Vincent Gallo, Jerry Lewis, Lily Taylor, and Michael Pollard, who Fay Dunaway really enjoyed hanging out with on the set of Bonnie and Clyde? I watched this movie, Arizona Dream, back when I was in my big Arizona phase. No, when I was in my Amir Kusturica phase. It's not as good as Kusturica's big hits, and American audiences, I think, were bamboozled. But pretty cool movie. I'd have to watch it again to really be sure, but hard to deny that it's got some vibes. Next, we have Barfly, subject of last week's video. Go watch that if you want to know my sort of mixed feelings about that movie. Now that the dust has settled, I think it's pretty good. Next, we have Bonnie and Clyde, and we're getting to the big hits here. I didn't rewatch this for the series, but I think it's safe to say that it's pretty good. I remember liking it when I watched it about 10 years ago. Next is Chinatown. It's also been a while since I saw this one, but again, who's going to argue? And to round out the big three, we have Network, which I just did a video about. I was shocked by how moved I was by that movie and how apropos it feels. I know everybody says that, but look, it's true. There were a couple of things I didn't get to in that video, a few hesitations even. I wish I'd thought more about the pseudo-religious elements of the film. Either way, though, an amazing movie. So that's the big three, but that's only 11 movies. Is this guy really about to say that Fay Dunaway's best movie is The Arrangement? Indeed, indeed. I will admit that I overrate that movie somewhat. I saw it at just the right moment in my life, and it had an emotional impact on me unlike anything I have seen since. Maybe Coming Home comes close, but man, that is a deeply special movie to me. If you don't know anything about The Arrangement, I have a video about it. It is an underrated movie, truly, even if it's not quite as good as I think it is. I was half expecting Dunaway's book to vindicate me by saying, oh, it was her favorite movie, but she actually doesn't talk very much about it, besides noting that her character was based on Barbara Loden, who she knew, and talking about Kirk Douglas a little bit, what he was like to work with. Okay, I said I'd seen 12 and a half Fay Dunaway movies. What's the half? Well, that's 3 Days of the Condor. I saw it as a kid, and I don't remember it really at all. Maybe I remember the first day of the Condor, but I don't know what happened on the other two, so I didn't rate it. I'd like to revisit it at some point. As often happens when I do a series on one actor or director, I think, I'm going to get tired of this guy, right? But the opposite tends to happen. And believe me, there's nothing like reading an entire autobiography to make you think, oh, I should watch this other one too. Oh, this sounds interesting. Oh, you got to see that. I was really torn between like 4 different movies for the end of the series, for this video, and I might come back to some of them. It's a question for the floor, actually. Do you prefer this format of doing a series on one person for a while, maybe even reading a book about them, or is it better to have more variety? I'm a little split on it. Anyway, the 3 that I didn't watch for this week were The Happening, Fay Dunaway's first movie with Anthony Quinn, Hogan's Goat, I'll come back to that one, and Mommy Dearest, possibly her greatest misstep. I'm also curious about The Three Musketeers, one of the most lowbrow movies that she was in, although it was a hit, and about the Amy Semple McPherson movie. If you don't know who that person is, by the way, look up their Wikipedia page. Very interesting. And about her role opposite Alan Alda in The Extraordinary Seaman, although that movie was almost a complete flop. I tried to find a copy of it the other day, couldn't track one down. In the book, she says, I don't think they screened that to anyone. So it might be hard to find. Anyway, one day I'll watch all of these. If you wanted to learn more about Fay Dunaway, there's 2 main places you would go. I've mentioned them both already. There's this HBO documentary from 2024 called Faye. It's pretty superficial. Really, it's pretty half-assed. There are a couple of admissions in that, though, that don't make it into the book, which is interesting, probably just because it's newer, and hey, maybe we've got a much more open culture these days, or I don't know why exactly her thinking would have changed here, but some of the stuff is that Dunaway mentions that she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in the movie. She talks about having struggled with alcoholism a tiny bit. It's only the barest mention. She mentions that her son was adopted, and she says that she thought about joining the Howard Beale Club at one point. All those things might remind you a little bit about today's movie. Well, not the adoption, but the other 3, sure. We'll come back to that. These admissions, I don't really like the term admissions because it's stigmatizing, but these things make you realize that the book, while offering some level of vulnerability, and while in general being a lot better than I had expected, the book is selective. Okay, the book. I didn't have very high expectations for the book. It kind of looks like it's being marketed to the daytime television crowd. I don't like the picture, and you know what they say. Always judge the book by its cover. It's from 1995, 30 years older than the documentary. Not much has actually changed in Fay Dunaway's career in that time, but still, you can see that maybe times has changed a little bit with the sorts of things that you hear about in the documentary. This book is written with Betsy Sharkey, who would go on to be, Betsy Sharkey, who would go on to be a film critic for the Los Angeles Times. I'm not sure how she connected up with Fay Dunaway. You fear that the whole thing is going to be ghost written, but actually it's pretty clear that Dunaway was involved in the book, at least somewhat deeply. There's a lot of things in it that only she would know unless they're completely made up, but I don't think so. Ultimately, I think it's kind of nice that Sharkey got credit for her work, and it sort of doesn't surprise me that Dunaway would do that she would feel particular about a certain type of academic protocol or something like that. In general, this book is way better than I had expected. There's a lot of interesting trivia in it. You do get a sense of Fay Dunaway, perhaps not exactly in the way that she intended, but she's in the book. Believe me, she's in the book. And yeah, I wish I had read this book at the beginning of the series because it gives a bunch of perspective on her work. It covers just about every movie that she was in. It's really thorough, almost the complete opposite of the documentary, which just breezes over stuff at the highest possible level. This book is quite thorough. It also covers just about every boyfriend that she publicly acknowledges. Honestly, the book is kind of moving. I think the first half was most interesting to me. Discusses her extremely telling childhood experiences, the lean years in New York City, and her big break. The book definitely has some weak points. It has too much pontification in it, opinions about all sorts of actors and directors. There's some sort of compulsion to render a verdict about every person that she brings up before moving on to the next one. It almost is serving as some type of name dropping. Well, I actually found Kirk Douglas to be a nice guy. Well, I actually thought that Anthony Quinn was quite sweet to work with. That kind of thing. What's the point? Anyway, the book is called Looking for Gatsby. This hints at two of its structures. First, there's Dunaway's attempt to find a replacement for her absent father. She talks about analysis, as in psychoanalysis, throughout the book, and it's clear that there's some psychoanalytic influence in it. Actually, it reminds me of this book, The Original Sin, no longer a library book, don't worry. But this is the autobiography of, any guesses? Well, the first autobiography, he wrote a couple more. First autobiography of Anthony Quinn. Again, The Happening, Dunaway's first movie, it had Anthony Quinn in it. Like Quinn, Dunaway was born into poverty, not quite as extreme. Anthony Quinn's life is truly crazy, and this is a very interesting book. Don't take it at face value, but man, it is pretty good to read. Yeah, his childhood produced a pretty broken individual, I would say. Dunaway is from Florida. She was born Dorothy Fay Dunaway, and sometimes reflects on Dorothy Fay almost as another person. Anthony Quinn talks about a young boy, a younger version of himself, at great length in his book. He's haunted by this boy. We sketch out like these long sort of screenplays of him like trying to chase the boy down or run away from him. I think both of these structures are kind of useless, but it's interesting that they both gravitated towards this sort of psychoanalytic thing. I guess it was in vogue, although this book is older, significantly. And that they were thinking so much about the transformations they'd gone through since childhood. Yeah, at the very least, it's not too much of a distraction to hear about Dorothy every once in a while. By the way, Anthony Quinn also has an interesting connection to Amy Semple McPherson. If you don't know who that is, look it up. I guess maybe I already said that. He was connected to the Angelus Church for a little while and hugely, hugely inspired by her. Dunaway's father was a cook in the Army. Her family often moved every 2 years or so. Later in life, many of her relationships would follow the same cadence. Maybe that's reading into things a bit too much. That's what she says in the book. The book does give a vivid portrait of a childhood on the fringes. Again, not the extreme poverty of Anthony Quinn, not quite as crazy circumstances, but a tough upbringing, always being the new kid and the outsider, really dealing with poverty, not being able to find her way into society until high school, when her parents, I think, had finally divorced and the family was a little bit more settled. In high school, she was extremely determined to fit in, to get good grades. She was a cheerleader and a star pupil. You know that movie Ordinary People? Sometimes credited with introducing Pachelbel's canon to the mainstream audiences. Anyway, there's a line at the end of the movie where someone tells another person that they're determined but not strong. I love that line. I do slightly different words, but I've seen many times with my own eyes how being determined, how having a lot of fuel, I mean, it's a virtue, but it's not everything. It can go wrong. There's other things you need, some sort of wisdom maybe. I don't know. I'm not going to make any big claims about Fay Dunaway. I'm not really saying anything that she doesn't say herself in the book. If you want a sense of who she is, though, read the first 2 chapters, get a picture of how she was raised and maybe what was missing, and you'll get a sense of a compulsion for acceptance that defined a lot of her life, perhaps, an unflinching drive, which is inevitably somewhat self-interested and somewhat isolating. When she finally has control, when she finally gets control of her life, she wants to keep it, she wants to do things the right way. Add to that maybe constant attention from men and eventually money and fame, and I think you get the picture. I learned some interesting things from the New York section of the book. I'll tell you this, and then we'll get to the movie we're actually supposed to be talking about. Fay Dunaway is sometimes thought of as a glamorous figure, but from the beginning, she was driven towards serious work. She went to college in the South at first to be near her high school sweetheart, a star player on her high school football team. That was also all she could afford at the time. She eventually transferred to Boston University because it had a prestigious theater program, and then found her way to New York City as part of, for a few different reasons, but she ended up in the Lincoln Center theater program, led by none other than, any guesses? Elia Kazan. Couple lessons here. First of all, Dunaway thought of herself through most of her career as a serious actress. Studying with Kazan put her into the method acting category. That can mean different things to different people, but Dunaway took things very seriously. It's kind of funny to read about her, on the set of some movies that in hindsight weren't good at all, and hearing just how committed she was to the details, or hearing how much she cared about it. No doubt she was ambitious and driven in her work. Note that Dunaway was never really in any classic movies. She came on the scene at a very particular time, and in some ways ended up being emblematic of that time. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The second lesson from the New York section, I guess, is that Fay Dunaway met a lot of people there that she would go on to work with throughout her career. She'd know these people for a long time. So she'd hang out with Elia Kazan, of course, and his future wife, Barbara Loden. Right, The Arrangement is autobiographical film about Elia Kazan, and Gwen in it is based on Barbara Loden, apparently. She also hung out with Dustin Hoffman, who she'd work with on Little Big Man. Robert Duvall was in their circle, too. She'd work with him on Network, of course. These Hollywood books always remind you that it's kind of a small world. It's kind of a small world that you want to be a part of. The lean years in New York, there's a romanticism to that that's pretty compelling. But let's skip forward to her big break. What was Fay Dunaway's big break? Question for the floor. It's not Bonnie and Clyde. It's a play called Hogan's Goat. In 1971, she would revisit this role for PBS, and I was thinking about watching that as the perfect movie to end the series on, but I have no idea what it's actually like. The play was written by William Allred, a Harvard professor who would sort of become a father figure in Dunaway's life. That play was a hit for Dunaway, and off-Broadway hit, and it got her in the door in Hollywood. She does a couple of crappy movies in the beginning of her career, like The Happening. She has a falling out with Otto Preminger, but Bonnie and Clyde comes along early on, really, and changes everything. In some ways, she skipped past a painful career phase, but on the other hand, she fought her way up through the theaters of New York. Not too long ago, she was thinking about settling down with Gene in Florida. In theory, she'd already learned her craft by the time she got to Hollywood. After all that, was Fay Dunaway actually a good actress, though? I'll leave that to you, maybe. I think so. Not amazing, maybe a little lacking in range, but like I said, she was committed to the craft, and she put together a career filled with great roles. Even in her not-so-good movies, she was always playing interesting characters. One of them is Lou Andreas Sand, a model at the center of Puzzle of a Downfall Child, a film directed by Jerry Schatzberg, the first film he directed, in fact. Is this a thinly veiled autobiography? Well, it's a movie about a photographer making a movie about a model, or at least doing some tape recordings to collect her story. Jerry Schatzberg was a fashion photographer, and he had made a bunch of tape recordings of a model that this movie is based on. He met Fay Dunaway as a photographer. The first thing that we learn about Lou Andreas Sand is that her name isn't really Lou Andreas Sand, just like Fay Dunaway's name isn't really Fay Dunaway. I already mentioned a few other things that Dunaway has in common with this character, but the genesis of the movie actually was recordings that Schatzberg made with model Anne St. Marie. Either way, it's clear that he was working in territory that he knew well. In the movie, Lou has a list of photographers that she refuses to work with. A list of photographers that she refuses to work with. Dunaway apparently only refuses to work with two directors, in case you were wondering. The aforementioned Otto Preminger and the other one, Roman Polanski. Supposedly, you can see Schatzberg's name on this list in the movie, the list of photographers that Lou doesn't want to work with. I didn't see it when I watched the movie, even though I was kind of looking for it. I guess I looked away, sneezed at an inopportune moment or something. On the IMDb trivia page, some random author speculates that it's just an inside joke. But in the book, Dunaway talks about exactly how his name got on that list. Schatzberg and Dunaway were together for about 2 years prior to making the movie. Remember the 2-year cycles? Schatzberg owned part of a trendy club in New York. Interesting guy. He had a lot of connections in the music industry. He knew Jimi Hendrix, for instance. You wouldn't really have expected Fay Dunaway to know Jimi Hendrix, but she probably did to some extent, at least. Dunaway helped get this movie made, helped get his career started as a director. And it was, pretty good career, really. I've reviewed Scarecrow on this channel. That's a Jerry Schatzberg movie. He also did Panic at Needle Park and The Seduction of Joe Tynan with Alan Alda and Meryl Streep. The twist here is that Schatzberg and Dunaway's relationship was ending when they made the movie. And it was a moment of artistic tension, right? Dunaway really thought about her roles being this method figure, was really driven. So she often had opinions about how things should be done. Artistic tension, personal stress, and maybe sadness that led Dunaway herself to write Schatzberg's name on the list. And I don't think I would describe it as a joke. A lot of Dunaway's relationships overlapped each other somewhat. And the end of her time with Schatzberg was somewhat precipitated by her budding relationship with Marcello Mastroianni. Apparently, she fell in love with him as they were making A Place for Lovers. It would be one of her most treasured relationships, but it ended in tears when he couldn't find his way towards divorcing his wife in Italy. There are a couple of characters in this movie that might allude to Mastroianni. Dunaway's book is called Looking for Gatsby, but it could also be called Sleeping with Married Men. She would do this again with Terry O'Neill, who is also a photographer. He took the picture of her the morning after her network Oscar victory. And their relationship was one of the final nails in the coffin of her marriage to Peter Wolf of the Jay Giles Band. Interesting. I'm not about to defend the institution of marriage, but as you read the book, you do wonder if some of this torment was self-inflicted. Dunaway writes that she was so often afraid of people leaving her, like her father had, that she would try to leave them first. A lot of her relationships are framed as righteous, if tempestuous, searches for true love. And I can get behind true love. I mean, who can't? You won't find many apologies in this book, though. She doesn't say much about how Looking for Gatsby could have affected other people, and maybe it doesn't feel like you need to when your own life has been rattled. There's a sense of sadness around her past loves, but I wouldn't call it regret or contrition. We see one pattern over and over in the book, which is Dunaway betting on herself and her own career. This ended her first serious relationship with her high school sweetheart, Gene, from the football team, remember? Maybe he was Gatsby all along. Maybe this is a story about the sacrifices a woman has to make for her career, although Dunaway's relationship with a woman's liberation isn't totally straightforward. A lot of people didn't like Network that much. Anyway, I bring all this up not to moralize about it, but because I think all these contradictions and entanglements, all this torment, is kind of what makes Dunaway in some ways. It's a big part of her characters, and in a subtle way, I think it grounds them in the 1970s. It really shows that Puzzle of a Downfall Child was made by a photographer. It opens up with some static shots that might as well be still images. It also has some, really nice compositions throughout. I like the style of the movie in general. The big problem with Puzzle of a Downfall Child, almost certainly, is that this story and the characters, are simply not engaging. For some reason, I'm losing my voice more when I drink water. We just got a little bit more to go. We'll survive. The story and the characters in the movie, not engaging. I suspect that the main plot line, which is about a model who is starting to face the repercussions of her work, I guess, as she gets older, that might be inevitable. That story is something that's probably profoundly moving if you experience it in person, if you see it happen to someone, which I'm sure Jerry Schatzberg did. But it sort of isn't enough to make a movie. Hollywood has a lot of movies about rises and falls. That's the American way. I mean, it's written in the pavement over there. And interestingly, it's kind of, this book too is the big story, the great American rise to fame and the inevitable trip back down. Maybe not all the way back down to the ground where you and I live, but to somewhere. And I mean, look, you get excited reading about her rise and all this stuff. Like, it's sort of compelling. But this story is just so saturated. It's everywhere. It's sort of a character more than a story at this point. And I think you probably need more than this to make a movie. It doesn't help that Fay Dunaway's character isn't very likable, I guess. If you're doing the Fay Dunaway series, that probably isn't going to be as much of a problem. I think this movie offers a fairly raw look at Fay Dunaway. We have to be careful about reading this as a true story about her because it simply isn't. But I have a feeling that there's a lot of her in the movie. Even for the film's flaws, like I said, I think it's pretty good. For one thing, I found it to be moving. Again, that may be because I'm at the end of the Fay Dunaway series and searching for who this person was, trying to see into her heart. I already said that I like the style. I want to come back to that for a second. I think the movie could be pretty boring if you don't latch onto its rhythms a little bit, which have a lot to do with the style. The movie has a sort of associative logic to it. You'll notice from even the earliest shots that the sound and the images aren't totally linked together. We often see an image and hear some other conversation behind it. This may have been a way to avoid recording sound on location, but I think it creates a pretty cool effect. These two threads cross over each other in an interesting way, although there is the occasional image that doesn't do much lifting. Okay, my computer exploded, thank you, Linux. So you've just witnessed the second ever cut on this channel, sort of. The movie is non-chronological, an ironic place to pick things up, and it can feel a little listless or even confusing or just boring, but I like some of the ways that it jumps between ideas and scenes. For instance, there's a sequence where Dunaway tells Roy Scheider, I think, that she doesn't like to kiss a man she doesn't know, something that's refuted by some other moments in the movie. Right after she mentions the kiss, we cut to an advertisement for breath mints playing on an old TV. Then we cut to a man at a bar looking over at her. Then we cut to her taking a communion wafer. Then we cut to her putting on lipstick and having some, like a makeup assistant, look at her mouth. What is this, the Tree of Life? Like I said, it's an associative logic, and I think the movie does strike at some profound ideas here. The mouth is an intimate thing, and the job is a physical one and an emotional one. You can probably guess a lot of the themes that the movie has in it before you even press play, and maybe when I said it right there, it sounded hokey. Maybe these cuts would look hokey, but I found it to be meaningful. Lou quotes Anna May Wong in the movie at one point. Wong said that every time she was photographed, the camera took a part of her soul. Dunaway puts the same quote in her book too, with no mention that it came from this movie. I think there is something sincere here from people who are working very closely to their own lives. There are also a number of good individual snippets in this movie. For instance, there's a moment when one of Lou's lovers comes out of the bathroom and she asks him if he had put the seat down. And he says, yeah. She says, oh, did your wife teach you to do that? This is the classic, the quintessential Dunaway cruelty. She asks him to put the seat back up. Is that just a show of force or will? Or is there a darker reason she wants it that way? Kind of a subtle thing. I was expecting this movie to be woefully unsubtle, and in some ways maybe it is, but actually I think its flaws kind of stem from being too understated, from leaving too much to the audience, which for me is pretty good news. Towards the beginning of the film, we hear Lou say that she's afraid of flying. Why? Well, because she once had a lover who died in a plane crash. We hear the story a couple of times. We even see it kind of acted out. The plane crash. Did you hear about his death in the newspaper? Did you read about it in the newspaper? Asked the photographer. Well, no. I just know that he got on a plane and he never came back. Leaving people and being left, the fear of loneliness, is a big part of this movie. Seems like it was a big part of Fay Dunaway's life too. Maybe it still is. Not too much later, Lou herself gets on the plane that will eventually carry her away from her lover, the photographer. Yeah, maybe the movie is kind of boring and unlikable, but it's also kind of sincere, and I think it's sort of the perfect way to sum up the Fay Dunaway series. And there we go. That's Fay Dunaway. That's the series. Maybe I'll revisit some of these movies or some of her other movies. There's a lot of things I still want to watch, but for now, that's it. And man, have I got some interesting movies for you now that we can explore a broader range of things.